Art seems to absorb whatever you put into it. I don't necessarily want to go in a fatalist or magical direction, but it does seem to me that art does have some ethereal aspect that we simply don't have good enough words to describe in English. I would reckon that if I have any German listeners, they could likely help us out with some beautiful, unpronounceable word that can define this ephemeral component of art. Regardless of verbiage, the point stands. Your art seems to feed off of you like some symbiotic plant, taking hold of your emotions, your thoughts and feelings, even your memories, and then planting them into itself. The more open you are to this, the less you fight the roots digging deeply into your soul, perhaps, just perhaps, the more progress you can make. This is hard though. You have to be vulnerable. Even if you don't plan on showing the art to anyone, you have to be vulnerable anyway. You open yourself up to seeing the reality of your past, the reality of who you are by letting your art drink deeply from your soul. Welcome to the session today. My name is Zach, and if you enjoy discussions like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. I would very much appreciate it. Today, we are talking about vulnerability in art. This came to me as I was putting together some scripts for some other things, just thinking about topics that are important and valuable to discuss with other artists. And vulnerability kept coming back. And it's kind of an interesting topic because most of the time it seems to be implemented in such a way where vulnerability is simply the being open about what you're working on, sharing it with other people, being okay with other people seeing it, maybe even being okay with their judgments or their critiques. But I find that the topic is a little bit more nuanced than that. And perhaps I shouldn't be surprised. Most topics are far more nuanced than we seem to take them for at face value. So for today's session at least, I would like to take a look at vulnerability in art, not with art that is being exposed to the world necessarily. If that happens, it's an ancillary thing. But being vulnerable with the art that you allow yourself to produce. Like I mentioned in the introduction, our art is like a plant that sticks its roots into us to get the nourishment that it needs. Perhaps it photosynthesizes from other things in the environment, but it's pulling the bulk of its nutrients from us. And so what we allow it to feed upon, what we allow it to use for nourishment, is obviously going to change the results, the final results of whatever that artwork is. Oddly, I am reminded of the Haligtree from Elden Ring. In that game, there is a massive tree called the Erdtree, and it is essentially the source of light, the source of life to this world, to the lands between. However, one of the demigods decided to grow his own version of this tree. He made his own tree, and he calls it the Haligtree, but he watered it with his own blood. So the tree itself is an embodiment of the ideals and the concepts that he stood for, this purity, the desire to make a home for all of the people who are outcasts and downtrodden in the lands between. I think that's a really beautiful metaphor and kind of comes into play today as we're talking about vulnerability in artwork. Your artwork is always going to be a reflection of you, of who you are. Even if you're working on contract or commission work, you're working on a prompt from somebody else, or even just something from a class, your artwork is inextricably linked to who you are. And I suppose the whole purpose of delving into and talking about vulnerability today is that maybe you ought to give into that a little bit more, or maybe just being aware of that facet is going to impact your art in some interesting ways. Now, of course, it would be hypocritical for me to preach this, to say this, and not think about what I'm drawing in the background here. This drawing started as just a quick sketch. I grabbed one of my brush pens and I just randomly created a whole bunch of lines with no intent. Now, as I start to work on it and define things, it is going to come to life. It's going to have much more texture and much more reality to it. But what was the concept here, and what about me is coming out in this artwork? Well, on a very tactical sense, I like making lots of tiny little lines like this. I enjoy the monotony. I enjoy the process of a drawing or painting once I'm far enough in where I can just concentrate on doing something for a little while. Obviously, the ideas are exciting and they're fun, but there's also something for me that is relaxing about just sitting here and implementing things. I don't have to pause and think a lot. So, ironically, a lot of my art has fallen into this kind of eldritch category where I make lots of things with wrinkles and eyes and awkward dark elements, and very little of that has to do with a love for those kinds of elements. It really comes from a desire to draw the wrinkles and the lines and the texture. You know, I could make these things smooth, but they're kind of less interesting for me, or maybe my skill is lacking to a point where they're just more difficult for me to actually portray. So when I sit down to make a drawing like this with very little concept of what I'm going to do, very little in the way of expectations, I am forced to confront the fact that my natural vulnerability, my natural tendencies come out in the piece. I often have characters like the little girl that you can see here being held by this beast, and I use them, I think, because they're analogs for me. They're analogs for a viewer, whether it's specifically me or not, I'm not sure. But there's something about being able to put yourself in the situation when you can see a small human. We all remember what it was like to be young, to be a child, to be scared of the dark, to be scared of the things that we don't know. And I think that fear just stays in us. It never quite goes away. We get older and we understand perhaps the things that we should be fearful of and things that we don't have to be fearful of. But there are deep-seated fears in all of us, I reckon, and I'm aware of a lot of mine, but they still exist, and sometimes being aware of them almost makes them exist more. And so they come out, I think, in my artwork. And again, I'm saying I think because I haven't sat down with a psychologist and had them like rummage through all my sketchbooks in my brain and figure out exactly why I do what I do. Not that I'm sure that a psychologist is ever really perfectly capable of doing that, but that's just why I'm using that verbiage specifically. But I think that I like putting characters in these situations because I felt like this a lot in my youth. I got uprooted a lot. I got moved to a lot of different places. I very seldom knew what was going on. I really spent a lot of time in books and in sketchbooks because those were something that was secure. I always had them with me. I didn't know necessarily where I was going to be sleeping or if we were going to live in the place we were living for a really long time. My dad traveled a lot with his work in the military, so there was a lot of just, what can I latch onto? What is secure? For me, home is very safe and always has been. But there were periods in my life where knowing whether I had a home or if we were being transient for a while was not something that I necessarily understood. And especially as a kid, you don't understand. And all of those moves have turned me into a person who really hates change. I like and find security in things staying the same and things being simple. I like spending time at home because home is a known. It's safe. And my home is a wonderful one. I have a wonderful family. And I know that not all of us have that exact situation, so I don't take it for granted. But in my artwork, then, there are certain things that come out because I am resistant to change in a way that is detrimental to me frequently. I will sit in a situation much longer than I should, or do something that is inefficient because it's a known, even though another part of me always pushes for more efficiency and more productivity. Pieces of my nature collide. And so sometimes I feel perhaps like that little girl who's being held by this beast. You are shackled to a reality that you didn't necessarily help create. And you just have to come to terms with what you're going to do about that set of circumstances. We don't have the ability to change everything that happens in our lives. We have the ability to change very little, actually. You might have heard the phrase before that control is an illusion. And as I mentioned that, I'm taken to Kung Fu Panda when Oogway tells Shifu that control is an illusion. And he says, well, no, it's not. Like, I can control when this thing is planted. I can control how it's handled. I can control a lot of things in my life. And Oogway says, well, yeah, but you can't control when it produces fruit. You can't control if it turns into a peach tree or an orange or a pear. It's going to be what it is. You do have some control, essentially, but you don't have control over everything, and there are certain things that you will never have control over. And for me, there's been a lot of freedom in recognizing how little control I have over everything. And so, in a lot of these art pieces, there's a character who's being subjected to things that are far outside of their control, things that they don't have any ability to really manipulate. And in most of these situations, though these beasts look grotesque and ghastly, they're not evil, they're not bad. And in fact, overreacting and fighting them would probably result in something terrible. But these little characters seem to almost have that childish naivety, where they see this grotesque mound of tentacles and eyes, and instead of being repulsed by it, they're just curious. And I find that for me, that has been the most productive way that I can go, is to analyze the situation for what it is, not try to dominate it, to control it, to understand that some circumstances are actually bad and some are good, but far more are just circumstances, things that you can understand, that I can seek to find ways that those things can benefit me and the people that I love, or just decide when I need to be a tree that bends in the wind. Total control is an illusion. It's not something that we as humans have the capacity for. It's probably why so much of our literature, so many of our stories are about control or seizing control, or it's about somebody else taking control away. Control is very important to us as people. And so a lot of my artwork, really outside of my own thought and outside of my own control, explores that aspect, because I've given in and I've allowed my art just to be what it desires to be. Not that I think that it is actually its own conscious being, but it does kind of feel like that sometimes as you work through things. All of this to say that embracing the vulnerable aspects of art, allowing your art to change and move and be what it needs to be, is a really beneficial thing. You can't always do this, perhaps, especially if you're working for a client or you're doing something for class, but I would encourage you to try to let your art be more that way, to try to let your art dip into areas that are more instinctive for you and maybe less planned. Allow the art to be what it wants to be, what it needs to be. Allow your subconscious, your unconscious mind to simply move with the shapes and the lines and create things. Maybe you'll end up like me. You'll end up creating all of these pseudo-benevolent monsters. Maybe you'll end up creating something totally different. It doesn't really matter. There's a soothing aspect to just allowing it to do what it's going to do. Well, as always, thank you for your time. I really appreciate you listening, that you gave up a portion of your time today to listen to me ramble about vulnerability or other things while you watch me draw in the background. If you are interested in joining our Discord community, there is a link to it in the description down below. Thank you to patron Who, What, Where, When for your continued support. And if you would like to support the channel, you'd like to see what's coming down the pipeline, get access to scripts and outlines before videos come out, or even have a chance to decide what kind of content comes out in the future, you can support this channel through the Patreon link below. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.